On that note, I will open it up to the overview of eTOD work and the relationship to Project Connect. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Rosie Truelove, I'm the Director of the Housing and Planning Department for the City of Austin. Thank you again for hosting this meeting, this joint meeting, and setting aside the time to better understand why an eTOD policy plan is important for our community. This is a critical time. Project Connect is a once-in-a-generation investment in our community, and we have the chance to develop in ways that not only improve our climate, our mobility, and our quality of life. We also have the chance, through Project Connect, to address historic inequities in our community with both better transportation access, but also with more housing, especially affordable housing, and increased access to economic opportunities to enable all members of our community to thrive. The goal of our briefing today is to provide you with an overview of the Equitable Transit-Oriented Development Policy Plan, what it will help to accomplish, and why it is important to have Council act now to implement the eTOD quickly ahead of design and construction of the Project Connect system in order to guide public and private development. Typically, land use is in place before or in tandem with decisions about infrastructure investment. In this sense, we are already behind as a community in preparing for the success of Project Connect. So accepting the policy plan and moving forward into more detailed planning and implementation expeditiously is important. These corridors and station areas are already seeing redevelopment interest today. So getting ahead of that with updated city policy and procedures is key to shaping equitable outcomes and cohesively supporting transit investments and community members. Once eTOD is accepted, council policy direction, staff will be able to use that guidance in land use and zoning decisions, preventing a case where lag time could mean decisions that are not supportive of eTOD and are made in the next, are made in the next several months that work to cross purposes for our eTOD goals. We're very excited to be here and to participate in the conversation. I want to turn it over now to Sharmila with Cap Metro.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, City Council and the Mobility Committee for this opportunity. I'm Sharmila Mukherjee. I'm Executive Vice President of Planning and Development at Cap Metro. And I would start by saying this is a unique, transformational, almost a generational opportunity that we have in front of us. Many other communities have gone through the same path of bringing light rail into their cities, and Austin is at a precipice of that. We have this time to plan for transit-oriented development in a way that is context-sensitive, scalable, and attainable for Austin. Why do we need to do this? And transit agency is not typically the entity that guides this process. We do not have land use authority. City of Austin does. We are here to provide a helping hand, and we were very fortunate to be able to receive four altogether, FTA TOD planning grants to support this effort. Cap Metro is committed to, hand in hand with Austin Transit Partnership and City of Austin, to make sure that the future light rail that comes to Austin really helps benefit the citizens of Austin and able to correct some of the historical transportation development mistakes that we are here to transform with these generational opportunities. The $3.15 million that FTA gave to City of Austin through Cap Metro to Austin, it is being used possibly one of the most efficient, prudent, and collaborative manner that could support and be almost presented as a template for how multi-agency collaboration should take place. I personally have participated in FTA Lessons Learned to talk about it, and I will pass it on to Anna Land to talk about all of the engagement that led to the development of this eTOD plan. It was a co-created, driven project, both by City of Austin and Cap Metro. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
That's great. Thank you for that overview.
And I think we have Annalan coming up later in the agenda. I think we're going to shift to to Warner Cook in planner principal in the Housing and Planning Department.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, council members, committee members, Mayor Pro Tem. My name is Warner Cook, as Rosie said, and I'm really happy to have this chance to get an even deeper dive and provide some answers to questions that we heard today and that we've been hearing from council offices and community members related to Equitable TOD. I'm going to walk us through what the actual draft resolution would do if council were to approve it on March 9th, because that has been a big topic of question. The purpose of the policy plan, as outlined in the original resolution from council, is to create a big picture framework and guidelines for how to start thinking about planning in the future for our transit investments to be successful and for our community members of all backgrounds to thrive. We know that transit brings a lot of new opportunities to Austin, but it also can create additional displacement pressure and end up harming folks. So in order to not repeat this pattern of harm and instead work to start repairing it, the eTOD policy plan offers a high-level guidance on ways we could improve these equitable outcomes that we're looking for current and future residents of Austin. In order to provide equitable outcomes, 6 eTOD goals were developed through our analysis and community engagement efforts, which Anna will talk about afterwards. These 6 goals will be the guiding stars so that we hold ourselves and our partners and our community accountable to, striving towards as we continue developing around Project Connect. These are going to be the lenses through which we consider how to implement eTOD and check to make sure that we are anytime we're making a decision about investments, programs, or regulations, it's furthering these 6 goals. So specifically on March 9th, we are asking council in the draft resolution as it's been posted for 4 things. First is to accept the eTOD policy plan, initiate station area planning in the Northeast Austin District Plan, initiate amendments to the Imagine Austin Comprehensive Plan, and initiate amendments to the Land Development Code. And I'm going to walk through each of these 4 things in a little bit more detail now. So accepting the policy plan. What does accepting the policy plan do? We've had a lot of questions about that, so I want to dispel some confusion I know is out there. It is a policy document. It represents our best thinking on how we can reach those 6 eTOD goals in the future that we want near our transit stations. It's basically a framework. One way I like to talk about it is thinking about it as the framework. We have the tools in the toolbox in the policy toolkit there. Not every tool, as we know, for every project is going to be right. Just like with every tool in the policy toolbox, there'll be some stations where tools apply. Some tools might apply differently across different stations. And so it's really important to think about it as a menu of options that council is directing staff to go explore more, work with our community members more to understand what those tools could be and come back for future implementation. So what the plan does not do is automatically apply those tools on March 9th. That's not how it's posted, that's not how it's written. The other things that it doesn't do is change city budget or funding on March 9th. The budget is the budget, and without amendments to it, there's not going to be any new funding or any reprioritizing of funding towards this effort. And the last thing, that this is something I've heard a lot, accepting the policy plan does not change anyone in Austin's zoning or regulations on any parcels on March 9th. What the draft resolution asks council to do is initiate that process to look at it. And initiating that process, which we think could take a year and a half to really work through some of those amendments with our community and analyze what the impacts would be, as some of the speakers this morning said. That's how you get from idea to reality, but the reality doesn't come until there's notice, petitions, public hearings at Planning Commission and Council, and ultimately adoption. So nothing on the 9th is any of those things I just mentioned. It does not change zoning. So then if on the 9th we're not changing anything, why are we taking action on the 9th, right? So we still need to work towards implementing the plan. Accepting the plan says this is the direction we want to go, and implementing the plans means this is how we're actually going to take those steps forward. What staff is envisioning is a two-step parallel approach. So we've got system-wide tools and items that we'll do for implementation, and then also geographically specific items. This parallel approach helps us efficiently and quickly start work towards the equitable outcomes and meeting our 6 goals broadly in Austin with a system-wide approach, but at the same time making sure that implementation proposals are tailored and geographically specific through that approach. And I've also gotten some questions about whether a system-wide approach would just be applied everywhere, or if it has to happen first and the geographic station planning happens second, or vice versa. So I want to clarify that we're talking about both of these things, the geographic station planning and the system-wide approaches moving forward in the next few years on parallel tracks. We don't want to see it as an either or. We really feel like it's a both and. That's the kind of urgency our community has expressed to us. And just because something is part of a system-wide approach, it doesn't mean that it's going to be blanket or it's going to apply the same way in every single station area. That's not what we mean when we say system-wide. The next part of the draft resolution on March 9th is initiating station area planning in the 11 station areas within the Northeast Austin District Planning boundary. This is an example of that geographically specific approach I was just talking about. We've already kicked off some vision plans with the North Lamar and South Congress transit centers, and I think some of the speakers today mentioned that we had a workshop last night. We had workshops for those geographic areas on the 28th and the 1st. Where we got really great, more in-depth local knowledge about what people like to celebrate, what brings them culture, what they would like to see improved in those neighborhoods. So if you're in one of those neighborhoods, please go to projectconnect.com/project/eTOD. There's more engagement in those 2 station areas going on now, and a survey open through March 21st. But looking at this map, you can see that we're talking about different parts of town. We're also talking about different kinds of transit service. And that was another thing that came up, was whether it should be rail or also include the Metro Rapid services. And as council directed staff in its initial resolution in June 2021, we're to look at this full system, this initial investment of Project Connect. It doesn't mean that it's going to look the same in every type of transit service, but we want to see equitable outcomes, whether it's a rail stop or a bus stop. By working through all these different types early, we'll get a chance to kind of get that under our belt to see what works in different parts of Austin or for different transit types. So it's not a predetermined outcome in any of these areas. The third thing that council is asked to do on March 9th with the draft resolution is initiate amendments to the comprehensive plan Imagine Austin. Our current growth concept map, which is on the screen in front of you, does not account for the Project Connect system. We've learned more about the transit investments in the last few years, and they're not reflected in our growth concept. So if council decides on March 9th to vote to begin amendment process for Imagine Austin, it would allow staff to start looking at how to incorporate eTOD into the comp plan, including with community input on how to do that. We would take that input and craft any proposed amendments to Imagine Austin, and then go through the formal engagement or the formal amendment process, which is laid out in our city charter. Once that is eventually incorporated, if council would, ultimately adopt those proposed amendments, staff would be able to start using eTOD typology as one piece of information when we think about requests for plan amendments and zoning cases in the future within station areas. And then the last thing, and probably the thing I've gotten the most questions about so far, is what is the land development code amendments that council would be asked to initiate on March 9th. And I already discussed a little bit about the different flavors of those at the February 21st work session, but I'm going to dive into even more detail right now. So, to understand what the proposed amendments are, you kind of also need to know what the current amendments are, or the current code says about TOD in Austin. And I'm definitely going to launch into what the eTOD overlay is as well. So today, the city's land development code spells out the process for traditional TOD planning and regulations. The traditional TOD approach, previously used to date, categorized each defined TOD into one of a few different classifications and spelled out specifically how dense and intense it should be. Should it be a regional center and a town center, et cetera? With eTOD, we're taking a more people-centered approach rather than the built form being the major focus. And so the regulations, we know, are only one way to get us towards our eTOD goals. We want to look at these current TOD regulations as well because we also only have 9 red line or park and ride sites as designated TODs in Austin. And we know from Council's direction that you're interested in us looking across the Cap Metro Project Connect system to consider other services as well. So to make our code more reflective of this eTOD approach we've been working on, staff is proposing a few different updates to the current TOD regulations. This would include updating the list of stations to the 98 station areas that are in the eTOD policy plan per council guidance. We'd also consider whether the existing initial or interim regulations still make sense for Austin and whether they really help us reach those 6 eTOD goals. And maybe they need to be tweaked more to get to our equitable outcomes we're looking for. So we envision community input as part of that process as well. We also want to look at the 2-step planning process, and I'll talk about what the 2-step traditional process used to look like in a little bit, to make sure it reflects how we're actually going to do that geographic station area planning going forward. The last type of land development code amendment staff is recommending for initiating on March 9th is to create the eTOD overlay, one of the tools in the policy toolkit. The overlay is not defined yet, and we think it could take, as I said, at least a year or year and a half or more to really do the analysis and the deep community engagement necessary to craft and apply this tool. When we would go and craft this overlay, we would also be looking at the guiding factors being equity, those 6 goals that I talked about, and community engagement to make sure that it's going to meet what we're looking for as a community. And when I talk about crafting, there's 4 bullets there about like, what do I mean to actually create an eTOD overlay? You have to think about what benefits we're going to be asking for in exchange for what additional entitlements, and that's going to be a community conversation. We're going to think about where and how to map it. And that's also part of the conversation. And then we have to think about how does it interact with all the existing stuff that's in Austin today in plans and regulations. And that's also part of the conversation. So that's why I say it's going to take a lot of work and it's going to take some time. This is not going to be created overnight. So we've also gotten a lot of questions that talk about like the voluntary word that's in the plan. And I recognize that that probably caused some confusion, the way that we worded that in the plan document. People have been asking whether it means it's opt-in or opt-out. You know, could a whole neighborhood say we don't want to do eTOD or something like that? And the answer is no. This is not going to be a process where entire parts of the city can just opt out of being part of the equitable outcomes that Austinites want. That would not be an equitable approach. That localized feedback on where it makes sense in a neighborhood is really, really valuable, but we know if we only listen to that kind of feedback, we're not going to have the chance to really reach our equity goals, right? If we just leave parts of the city from doing their part. I've also heard concerns that the overlay would require redevelopment, that like as soon as on March 9th it's passed, then there's this overlay and it makes you redevelop your property. That's never been the case. Any property owner at any time can choose what they would like to do with their property, including not anything, exactly what it is today. If you choose to redevelop, you can use your base zoning. You don't have to use any of the additional bonus programs that may or may not apply to your property. So even if you have a V in your zoning string today, you don't have to use V, right? You can use your base zoning. So I wanted to clarify that. And then the idea that it would automatically be applied. Again, the answer is no. On council, voting for eTOD resolution on March 9th would initiate the process to start looking at this tool, but it does not automatically start it being applied today. So if you want staff to look into this further, then please vote for that on the 9th. But when the proposal comes back at the end of the process and our analysis and engagement, council will be able to vote on it, amend it, even flat out reject it, as has always been, you know, your will as a dais. Okay, so that was a lot on the system-wide approaches. Now I'm going to dig in a little bit more to the geographic approach. Like, what does a eTOD planning process look like? We just kicked off the 2 in North and South Lamar. We're asking for some more to be started in Northeast Austin. And what is that like? So our current TOD regulations in the Land Development Code have a really prescriptive way of how we do TOD planning for traditional TODs. And so the first thing is there's initial regulations. As soon as a TOD is mapped onto a parcel, there's initial regulations that apply. They cover things like building setbacks and kind of parking restrictions. They don't do much, but they do just like a little bit to make sure that the pedestrian environment is a little bit more friendly in a TOD. So that's kind of the immediate step. I called it step 0. Step 1 is to go with the community to craft a station area plan. This is going to set out the vision, but it's not a regulating document. It gets amended into existing neighborhood plans, but it's not going to change anybody's zoning. And then the second step of the traditional process is the regulating plan. And this basically creates a new zoning framework. You get dash TOD to your zoning string, and you have to go to the regulating plan to see what you can actually do with your property. So in contrast to that current process, the eTOD process that we're looking for is not quite the same. We still think that there could be use in interim regulations that apply system-wide, hence why staff is asking for the chance to go look at those and see what works. And we also think something like this overlay bonus program that would apply system-wide could be really useful to support our goals. Again, it might be in all station areas, but it might not be on all parcels. What staff really knows is that this vision plan that we've done in the past is a really valuable tool to understand what geographic areas are interested in for the future of their community. And getting the implementation of that plan has always been a little bit of a challenge. So there's lots of ways to implement plans. One of them is regulations. But there's other things like investments and setting up community partnerships and programs of these natures, new supports for small businesses. Those are not regulations. So we recognize that because eTOD is trying to take a really holistic look at how to implement the vision for a station area, it's not going to be the case in every station that new regulations are needed in that area.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
On your interim regulations that apply system-wide, and I'm sorry if you said this and I just missed it, land use regulations or not?
So let me go back to this slide really quick. So this is what's in our current TOD regulations. We don't exactly have an idea yet what needs to be updated in that or not, but it does prohibit certain uses. So something like a really large surface parking lot would be prohibited, right? And it also talks about setbacks and making sure building entrances, are close to the sidewalk and easily accessible. So does that answer your question?
A little bit.
We would want to look at those uses and make sure that they're still the right uses if we updated those.
Okay. And then you may get this somewhere else, so I'm sorry if I'm jumping the gun here, but one of the things in the near term that I want to make sure is somewhere in this process is coordination with ATP and with others to make sure that we are taking the action we need to take as a council when it comes to land use decisions in order to not score so poorly on federal metrics that determine the funding we're going to get. So if we're, I see it both. One, if we're going to make these investments, we need to have the decision or the type of housing and land use around them that actually make it a good investment. We don't want to waste that money. But two, we also want to be prudent with the taxpayers' dollars and want to get as many federal dollars as we can. And right now, in my discussions with ATP and others, we are scoring horribly when it comes to these lines. And so I want to make sure we don't wait until we're building the station to make those changes, but that we are somewhere in this process recognizing changes we might need to make today so that we qualify for dollars to get the lines built.
Yeah.
Councilmember Riddle.
I just want to reiterate that point, that let's not put the cart before the horse. The number one goal of the transit-oriented development is to get riders on the line to build housing around the stations. I just, I understand there's a lot of work to do, but we're talking about a lot of things. We're not talking about that. And so that is the number one priority. If we don't do well on that, we don't get federal dollars. If we don't get federal dollars, the line is not going to be what we want it to be. If the line's not what we want it to be, we don't have that benevolent cycle that creates the resources that allows us to support the people that, are threatened or displaced. So I really appreciate Councilmember Reinald's point, and I just want to reiterate that.
I agree with those, and would just add the caveat that allowing people to be in our community and not have to be car dependent is a big high-level goal from this. And so it's not just about driving ridership, but it is about better air quality, less congestion, more space for trees and people, and less of the concrete. So I would just add that extra layer to, that angle of it. Are there any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And we have been collaborating really closely. We have people here from Cap Metro and ATP today that can even better speak to the actual timeline for grant scoring. I know is on everybody's mind. Jen Pine is with us, so great question for when we get to the Q&A. But I do want you to understand that there's both, there's a criteria that talks about kind of what's on the ground today. What are the population? What are the jobs, that FTA looks at? And then there's also a criteria that talks about what policies in place, what could be there in the future. And so eTOD would definitely fit in that second category of if it's accepted, what could be there in the future. But the sooner that one implements eTOD and starts actually moving through some of those next steps and action items, the more likely it has a chance to impact that first criteria about what's on the ground today. So that, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A because I know that that's really of a lot of interest. So I know that we got a little bit behind, but I'm glad for the question. I really appreciate it. I also wanted, I think I covered, yes, this. I wanted to talk about relationship to other work. There's been other work that council has been working to do to try to ensure that Project Connect is successful. Recent code amendments, but also existing plans and regulations that are along the lines. And so we've gotten some questions about how that would relate to eTOD station area planning, or what about district level planning? Are we only doing planning in the station areas? And so I wanted to make sure that folks knew that in addition to eTOD station areas, we're also planning to do these other small area and district level, and when it makes sense, incorporate eTOD, like for Northeast Austin where there are stops, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be applied to areas that don't have these transit investments coming to it. And then we are going to need to consider how these different recent amendments or existing plans and things are going to factor into some of the policy tools as we start to develop those. So that is also very much on staff's mind. And then back to maybe a little bit of your point, council members. What is the timeline? What things are we already doing that support eTOD? So based on our staff capacity, understanding the processes that we have to go through, like procurement and the code amendments and charter requirements, as well as how long it takes to actually do engagement in station areas and start to develop a vision, this is kind of our best thinking on a potential timeline for some of those implementation steps I talked about today. The top two would be some of those system-wide approaches, the bottom two being some of those geographic specific approaches. And this has been coordinated with our partners at Austin Transit Partnership and Project Connect office here at the city, as well as Cap Metro, to understand, what the timelines are for light rail design and grant funding submittal. Then my last slide here, for those that are wondering, what are we already doing? Are we doing anything today? The answer is definitely yes. The Housing and Planning Department has, while we've been working on this overall framework, we've still already started doing some implementation things that support Project Connect and support these eTOD goals, especially through general obligation bonds or the $300 million with anti-displacement funding that's been approved. So there's just a handful of things. I know that Director Truelove gave you all a really good comprehensive overview at the Housing and Planning Committee on Tuesday and touched on a few of these things that Housing and Planning Department does. So we'd also be happy to answer some questions later on about those. Thank you.
Can I ask and I don't know if you're the right person to ask this question. It's from the draft document. It's something that jumped out to me. I want to make sure I'm reading it correctly first and foremost, but then if there's lessons learned or why we see this. It's on page 10. It's talking about commuting and car ownership shifts. And the statement is that in census tracts where we have TODs, that transit ridership to work in these census tracts of study have seen significant reduction instead of an increase.
That's correct.
And I wanted to understand if we have looked at that and said, tried to understand why is that happening, and clearly something we're doing is not quite working. So have we figured out maybe to go in a different direction a little bit on some of this, or I'm just trying to.
Yeah, there's probably a lot of factors why that is the case, but you're correct that in census tracts that contain our 3 adopted TODs, we have seen a decrease in folks taking transit to work between 2010 and 2020 census data numbers. And so some of the things that could be at play there are that it's still really easy to drive and park a car. Another thing that could be in play is that there are fewer people with families, fewer low-income people that are renting or owning units in these TODs. Those are other facts that are in the little brief analysis that we did there. So these shifting demographics and kind of commuting patterns are not what we'd hope to see out of our TODs, which is another reason that we're looking at a new approach for eTODs, because that's not going to actually help us reach our climate goals and our congestion mitigation goals and things.
I'll allow a couple more questions, but we still have 2 whole sections of presentations to get through before Q&A.
I will. Oh, I guess I could wait. Yeah, I could wait until Q&A then. I have quite a few questions. So
That'd be good. I know there's just a lot of information, and we may end up not having time for Q&A if we ask all our questions on the first presentation.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that turns us over to Anna Lan, Principal Planner at Cap Metro. And we're going to hear about the engagement process to date. Welcome.
Good afternoon, council members, chair and vice chair. My name is Anna Lan. I am a TOD manager at Cap Metro. I'm very happy here today to talk through our engagement process. An equitable approach to DoD would not be so without intentional, meaningful, and inclusive community engagement. So a cornerstone, maybe next slide, please. Thank you. A cornerstone of our engagement process is facilitating that community input through the planning process to define equity and also to help us establish what equitable outcomes are needed across the station areas. This project differs in its approach because it has added additional weight to voices not included in past multi-generational planning efforts. So in essence, turning up the volume on key community voices and also compensating them for their time and knowledge. We have a variety of engagement touchpoints. Some of the more traditional outreach, such as the public meetings, stakeholder presentations, tablings, and surveys, worked really well in the past, but we acknowledge that these are not reaching deep enough into our communities, our riders, our residents. So we focus our engagement towards more targeted peer-to-peer approach. And we do that through regular CAC briefings. We have focus groups with grassroots residents, one-on-one interviews, as well as community connectors. Next slide, please. The community connectors and CAC working group, I think, deserves a shout out. The CAC, or the Community Advisory Committee, is formed to advise Project Connect on issues of equity and anti-displacement. They formed an eTOD working group with us that we meet at least monthly, if not more regularly, depending on the project status, to not just review documents or decisions that are already made, but they roll up their sleeves and they're in the sausage-making process alongside us. We also have 12 community connectors recruited from a pool of over 151 applicants. They represent 7 out of the 10 districts in Austin, and they have extensive community organizing background. And they represent a range of Austinites, from locals to newer transplants, from retirees to students. And they really help us reach deeper into their network and participate in events that we as Cap Metro may not have the ability to attend. So with them, we have reached over 330 additional people for engagement and attended over 40 different events. Next slide, please. Our engagement timeline is quite extensive. We have devoted significant staff and resources to make sure that we have the deepest reach as possible. So there are 4 total engagement phases that corresponds to key project deliverables. The first, when we kicked off in 2021, we focused on defining eTOD goals that Warner showed earlier. And we delivered case studies of comparable studies from different cities around the country. In the next phase, we wanted to verify those goals with the community and introduce policy. And from then, we delivered an existing conditions dashboard, which is publicly accessible through the Project Connect website, where you're allowed to go in and look at the key demographic characteristics, land use, real estate of those impacted neighborhoods. In the third phase, which is divided into 3 and B, but this really consists of the eTOD policy plan, we went out and engaged community on policy and program application, as well as the station typologies. From this set of engagement, we delivered the policy toolkit, which is incorporated as part of the eTOD policy plan, as well as the priority tool dashboard, which is an interactive, publicly accessible dashboard that shows the existing conditions of the area and also the missing pieces that makes it a complete neighborhood. And also in the current stage, we're in phase 4, delivering station area vision plan, which is currently ongoing as of today still. And this spring going forward, we hope to deliver the station area vision plans for North Lamar Transit Center and South Congress Transit Center, as well as the East Riverside Corridor update and releasing the eTOD final report. For our engagement, we try to engage and let the public know this project through a variety of ways. We have surveys, we have social media blasts from City of Austin and Cap Metro, a lot of tabling events. We printed out bus cards to go inside our buses with QR codes that will lead to the project website or to the existing survey. We reach out to grass top and grassroots organizations. We even have UT students involved in part of the engagement. And as Warner said, we had a public workshop as of 6:30 last night. This list was blasted to over 7,000 people. So everyone who signed up to stay connected to Project Connect should have received an invitation to sign up and register. So in terms of basic stats, for public workshops, we've held 6 citywide sessions with over 321 participants. We have had 40 sessions of focus groups with 243 participants, over 2,300 and counting survey responses, over 40 organized events, monthly CAC eTOD working groups, as well as regular presentations to committees and commissions, and continuously attending eTOD connectors events and outreach places. And I want to acknowledge that a lot of these happened during the pandemic. We tried our best with virtual outreach. We try to be flexible with our time, offering sessions in morning, evening, in Spanish only, with ASL only. All of those are accessible during every single public workshop. Next, please. The eTOD policy plan engagement was not a quick process. It took us about 5 months through multiple vetting and public workshops and surveys and focus group to get to where we are today. We started with about 75 tools that were provided by our consultants and vetted them through all internal stakeholders, city agencies, departments, CAC connectors, and we whittled them down to 51 tools. Then we further workshopped those tools with stakeholders. And then we went out into public. We had surveys asking folks how they feel about certain policies as applies to the area. We continue with focus groups. We had interviews with different agency implementation leads, small businesses, developers, both affordable and market. Then we went another round of vetting with all of the stakeholders, and now we have it down to 46 tools. These 46 tools are meant to be aspirational and very high level and buildable upon the future. So this is not just be all and end all. And with these 46 tools, again, we went back to the community. We had public surveys and focus groups to talk through priority and applicability. And this ended with the eTOD summit and input through the Speak Up Austin process. We've heard from many people, so this is just a very small representation of some of the key themes in these areas that we've heard. One of the most important and most popular policy is advocacy for more affordable ground floor lease for smaller businesses and more flexibility in permitted ground floor uses. People were very concerned about there were a lot of programs to help with assistance, but the barrier in application is very high, especially for business owners whose primary English is language is not English. Concerned that they need ongoing support versus just one-off funding. Expansion of certain construction interruption fund that's already in place. Also just direct rent relief. And also we have comments that we cannot forget the small businesses such as food trucks and how they're impacted during the construction. Next slide, please. For housing, the number one thing we've heard is the barrier of entry to apply for affordable housing is just too high. I myself took a try. I applied for one of the developments, and the application was over 70 pages long, and it required a lot of information. And it was even a tough application for me to go through. We heard that the city really needs to take a stance on providing high affordable housing goals. Concerned that as fast as we're trying to implement eTOD policy, that the regulation is simply not fast enough to keep up with the market. We've heard that there are a lot of support for homeowners, but what about renters? And not affordable housing also doesn't mean that we always have to build new buildings, but we can use some of the funds to revitalize the existing stock. And creative ways to add affordable housing, such as more co-ops or individual leases. Of course, in every conversation, we hear grumbling about tax breaks for homeowners, as well as direct down payment assistance. Next slide, please. In terms of transportation, we heard the most that people need to have a safer environment getting to their station and walking home. We need more reliable service, and people have expressed interest in transit stipend cards, where you can use it to use a variety of transportation modes. We need to have enough park and rides near these key station modes so that we encourage people to actually get on the trains and buses. And we need to think about maybe expanding our network and partnering with large employers so that you can have bus passes and attract staff to convert to transit. And of course, safety features like we need more lighting or overpasses. We need to provide shading and provide water fountains at the stations. Next slide, please. Healthy neighborhoods. The number one thing we hear in almost every single engagement is that we need to have dependable childcare and childcare grants. We need to have places around stations for civic places, for libraries, for parks. We need to have less concrete and less impermeable surfaces. We should have a lot more community input in this design and planning of the station areas. And I like this comment a lot, make pedestrians visible in this process. Next, please. In terms of employment, we should attract a diverse pool of businesses, not just maybe the concentrated tech businesses, but quality also means jobs that provide health care and retirement. We heard that we should provide job training with ACC and other schools so that the local folks can train as needed and transition into permanent staff. Project Connect is a very large project. And also that we need to have a dependable transit so that people are able to get to their job and back on time. Next, please. This is my last slide, and again, this is a very small example of how we incorporated public input into our toolkit. The toolkit has been tweaked many times. We have added tools based on community input. We've also taken away tools that worked really well in other cities, but that are not really applicable to Austin. So some of the for example, there were a lot of proponents for soft density by right. So this is a tool that we added in based on recommendation from city staff and the CAC. We have the equity scorecard for TOD project, which is a really great idea to keep track of our development as it pertains to our 6 goals. This is a conversation that's already starting between the 3 agencies. So we already started implementing that. There were some tools that were removed as well. For example, including parking in the FAR calendar for TOD zones, because they felt that this is too big of a jump for current requirements and it may be a barrier to obtain financing to build new developments. So we scaled it back and introduced more of a phased approach. We have also removed affordable housing replacement ordinances because legally in Texas, we cannot do that. And some smaller ideas such as the shop local campaigns because it requires a lot of resources without the greatest impact on return. We'll be happy to answer later on the question if you have any specific question on how we incorporated public engagement and voices into the policy toolkit. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. We really appreciate it. We have also added that into the message board post as a link. We'll try to make sure everything's included in the backup for Mobility Committee later, but we know a lot of people were working very hard on getting these presentations created for us. The final section is going to be the Community Partner Rapid Roundtable. So let's invite up a vase. I see a vase up there. Bill, I see you. Paulette. Paulette is participating remotely. We see you. Do you want to test your microphone just to make sure we can hear you?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, it's very low, but it is working. Yeah, why don't y'all come up and sit down? We tried to give y'all enough chairs. And then Jake Wegman and João Paulo Connolly. I know I saw JP. Bless you. I don't know that we've ever needed infrastructure here in Chambers to accommodate all of the voices that we invited to come be a part of this conversation. Let's start with a vase. Let's give you about 5 minutes to speak a bit about this process and your involvement.
Do I need to?
I don't know that
Seems
mic
to be
is
working.
on.
Is it? Okay.
There we go. Thanks.
So thank you, chairs, and thank you, everybody, for giving us this opportunity. My name is Aves Azhar. I serve as chair of the Community Advisory Committee for Project Connect, providing guidance to the Austin Transit Partnership, City of Austin, and Capital Metro on all issues related to Project Connect that include equity and anti-displacement. I'll just start off by saying how much we appreciate staff's partnership and work on the community engagement of this work. The Community Advisory Committee from the start, as Anna was laying out that timeline, we've been involved in that conversation. We formed a working group that was part of this work. A reminder that the CSC is community members who voluntarily serve to guide this work. And so we were part of this process from early on. We also really appreciate their work on really this time making an engaged effort of working with the most impacted folks, communities of color, working class folks in our city who are often not included. And this work was done in multiple ways, but most supreme, it was done through the work of the community connectors, who were actually community members from impacted communities who were provided stipends to do this work in their neighborhoods, in their communities, bring that feedback. And I think that's very meaningful and worth reminding everybody of. And we really focused on making sure that folks with disabilities, folks with different abilities, looking at seniors, all of those pieces are very much part of this conversation. The second part of this is really a reminder, this is already mentioned by our staff, from the Community Advisory Committee's perspective, TOD planning is really, really critical because it is really important for the work that we're doing with the FDA on getting grant applications in. So we want to make sure that we have the ability to rely on federal funds to complete this work and enhance what our local voters have already provided us with. We also really want to thank staff for their work on looking at the work of complete communities. So simply not just looking at sort of regular metrics of TODs, but looking at equitable TOD and council's guidance in this regard of making sure that we're looking at things more broadly. And I think that in itself is an important aspect to remember. However, one thing that we want to mention, this is coming from a recent a recommendation that the CSC made. I just want to point out to a commitment to accountability, and this includes meeting goals, making realistic promises, delivering on deadlines in a timely manner, and engaging with the community. And from our perspective, what this means is that although this is a great plan, we do have a little bit of worry in terms of really making sure that while we have a broad toolkit, we are very conscious and realistic in our commitments to the community of saying what are pieces that can move forward right now, what cannot. And I'll talk a little bit about what we can do in that regard. The biggest one, perhaps from our perspective, is really distinguishing between what tools are regulatory in nature and what are subsidy-based. That's a big question we have because we know that certain tools will require subsidies that are already available. Certain might require subsidies that are actually not something that exists in our city infrastructure right now. And some are regulatory in the sense that they can be enacted by council at their will without a fiscal impact. So I think that might be something for us to consider very seriously. I also want to say that we really, from the CSC's perspective, in our anti-displacement work as well, we are really guiding to say that we should be, while we're working on all these station areas, and it's very critical to look at it system-wide for our federal competitiveness, we also want to make sure that we are prioritizing the light rail, fixed route, bus rapid, and other infrastructural priorities that are going in place right now, particularly as we move past some of these key decisions around alignments and stations. How do we make the most, sort of get the most bang for our buck for really focusing on those areas first for planning where we can actually start seeing some changes around infrastructure as well? And while we, really want to focus on the, areas that are threatened with the risk of displacement, we understand that we will be utilizing the $300 million for anti-displacement from Project Connect for some of this purpose. We also want to really acknowledge that those funds are not enough by any means. As we're doing this work in year 3, we're realizing that the time horizon for those funds is short and the volume of those funds is short. So we will have to leverage other pieces of funding that are available and resources that are available. Also, the conversations that we had in the working group with our staff was really how critical it is to create housing and employing capacities that support transit around station areas for a successful transit system. And this is critical from multiple perspectives. From the CSC's perspective, one key piece is we are very much interested in having a successful Project Connect. And in part of that is ensuring that there are enough riders around the system to actually be able to use it. So those housing capacities, employing capacities are really important to make that work. It's also important from the perspective of affordability, really making sure that there's more opportunities for people to access the transit system. And lastly, also from a perspective of sort of having more designed and well-designed walkable and different spaces, ensuring that we have that around our station areas to provide those infrastructural improvements that are necessary. We also want to really focus on, while we're looking at displacement risk in certain parts of the city, but really focusing on housing in high opportunity areas as well, particularly areas that have been historically exclusionary. And you'll see this in the typology that our staff has developed, and we had a pretty robust conversation about this to really ensure that this is a part of addressing our segregating practices in the past and our commitment as a community to affirmatively further fair housing. How do we really make sure that we're focused on high opportunity areas and expanding more housing and employment capacities there so more people in our community can access them? The CSC also talked very significantly about parking reform, and this includes not just looking at seeing how we can really move towards more robust parking reform, but also seeing if we can decouple housing and parking. Really, from an affordability perspective, allow more folks to not have to pay for parking and rather for housing so that they can access parts of our city. And this, again, is an important perspective both from affordability and from our ability to housing capacity, but also in terms of really ensuring that we're maximizing transit usage. If we really want to make sure that we have workable transit, we want to make sure that people around there are not incentivized to, have cars. And I'll give an example. If you've ever, taken the red line to the Crestview station, you get off and the first thing you see is surface parking and 2 parking garages. And what we see is essentially that we've created a TOD where we are disincentivize people to use that transit system. And for the people who use the transit system, we're really creating a quality of public space that is not perfect for them, because you're having to crisscross against multiple parking lots to get to your eventual destinations. In terms of mapping TODs, I really do want to mention that it is really critical to address not just traditional walkshed metrics that have historically been used in the past, but we had a pretty robust conversation from a presentation that's happening on the bike roll ATX work, walk, bike roll ATX work, and seeing how do we really look at bike sheds as well. So what this may look like is that for rapid systems, we're talking about up to 1 mile out from the station area. And for light rail, this can go up to 2 miles out from station areas. So really seeing how can we do some more robust planning around station areas to support not just walkability, but also bikeability, and having those pieces in. I'm sure coming to the end of my time, and I'll stop there, but I will say again, thanking staff for the work that they did on engaging with the community. It really was a very engaged process, and we particularly as a community prioritize working with those who will be most impacted by this, particularly those at risk of displacement. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. Let's go, I don't know if it matters which order we go in. Let's go with Professor Wegman next.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jake Wegman. I'm on the faculty of the Community and Regional Planning Program in the School of Architecture at UT. And thanks to all of you for the opportunity to comment today on this important work that you're all doing. And these remarks, of course, are my opinions only and don't represent those of UT. So I'm just going to start with a little tough love. I think Councilmember Vela was suggesting this earlier, but the fact is transit-oriented development is hard. For over 30 years, it's been something like the holy grail of urban planning across the United States. But unfortunately, aside from a handful of cases that you hear about over and over again, truly successful TOD has been much more common in Canada or Mexico or overseas than it has been here in the US. And of course, true eTOD is even rarer than successful TOD. So in the spirit of cheering for what the city and Cap Metro and ATP are all trying to do, let me offer 3 suggestions. So first, I urge some focus in the planning efforts. And I am surprising myself to find some agreement with some of the commentary earlier, but as I read the policy plan, I am a little worried that the eTOD planning peanut butter could be spread too thin. For instance, I'm somewhat skeptical that new rapid bus stops in of themselves are likely to attract new development that wouldn't otherwise take place. There isn't much evidence that even true BRT, bus rapid transit, attracts development in the U.S., and of course that's not what the rapid bus improvements will be. They'll be very useful. I don't know that they will in of themselves induce development. So that's just something to think about. TOD is really hard, and in my view, better to do less in the most promising locations and to do it well, rather than try to do everything and then risk not accomplishing very much. My second recommendation is to get value capture financing mechanisms in place as soon as possible. Don't wait until you've completed the planning work, because you're going to really need these dollars within specific station areas. Anti-displacement funds and other existing city sources have very important roles to play, but as Aves was saying before, there are a lot of other demands on them other than just eTOD. And then density bonuses can also play an important role in some cases, but they are a delicate mechanism, and they're highly sensitive to both location and to fluctuations in the business cycle and the housing market. So they're unlikely to get us to a Mueller-like share of, let's call it 25% below market rate housing within a given station area. And in my view, to do that, the city is going to need to capture the property value uplift that's already happening right now, as Director Trulove mentioned earlier. That's already happening around the most development-ready station areas. And the city is going to need to stockpile what I think could be tens of millions of dollars in city subsidies needed to make real eTOD possible in some of these station areas. If you do it right, if you get that value capture mechanism in place, then instead of pitting market rate housing and below market rate housing against each other in a zero-sum trade-off dynamic, if you do it right, you're joining them at the hip instead and creating a virtuous cycle. If you get it right, then building a market rate condo development next to a station can work towards eTOD rather than against it. It would just mean that there would be more tax dollars pouring into the city's coffers that can subsidize a nonprofit to build below market housing in that same station area. Or maybe it can be used to acquire a key parcel when it comes up for sale so that it's available to transfer to a nonprofit several years down the line. In my view, it doesn't matter if the market rate and below market rates units are in the same buildings, so long as the city is meeting its overall goals of affordability levels and unit type mix within the station areas. In other words, so long as the E is being put into eTOD. And I have thoughts about how best to do this value capture, but for reasons of time, I won't get into it now. And then my last suggestion is to don't just do eTOD planning. Also do eTOD urban design. In my view, it'll be well worth the cost. In some cases, the city can and should go even beyond that and get into the eTOD land development business. For the best results, the city is going to need to steer the ship on designing the public realm around these new stations, defining any new streets or other public spaces that need to be built, and designating the building parcels that will get built out. This, I think, is the great lesson from the success of Mueller. The best results in terms of public realm and mix of uses and affordability come when the city dictates the terms, and then make sure that developers, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, propose projects that align with the city's vision. The city needs to keep a firm hand on the tiller. Let developers execute the city's vision for each station area piece by piece, rather than leaving it to those developers to provide the vision themselves. So just to sum up, finally, TOD is hard and eTOD is even harder. To succeed, I think, in my view, the city should do three things. First, focus limited capacity for planning efforts on the most promising station areas, which will likely be light rail station areas. Second, get value capture mechanisms in place as soon as possible before we know what's going to be happening around those promising locations. And finally, steer the ship on station area urban design and even land development rather than waiting for the developers to do it for you. Thank you for your important work shaping the future of Austin, and thanks for the opportunity to speak this afternoon.
Thank you for your comments, Dr. Wegman. JP, do you want to go next?
Sure. It'll be, that's fine. My comments won't be quite so polished, but I just wanted to share my perspective on the process, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and do so. I am also a member of the Community Advisory Committee for Project Connect and was able to participate in the focus groups for this process that resulted in this policy document. And I do want to make a few comments on the focus groups and the process that got us here. I think somewhat contrary to some of what was said a little earlier this afternoon, the focus groups actually had a really strong intentional effort to bring in and include voices that are seldom included in these planning processes. So there were actually people of color at the table from low-income and working-class communities. A lot of time was given to really hear people out, hear their issues. There was a diversity of perspectives represented in those rooms. Those conversations were long. There was passionate discussion. There was a lot of wealth of input and perspectives that were gathered through that process, and I don't want us to lose sight of that fact. Some really good engagement did take place to get us here. There are also some, questions and concerns that I still have with regards to kind of what resulted, which I think is a very a powerful document full of wonderful tools that everybody likes to see, that wants to, not many people want to see, things that the community needs and wants. However, we don't want to get people's hopes up, right, and talk about all of these amazing tools and products and things that we can deliver, and then not be able to deliver those tools. So I think we have to have a lot of clarity when we say, okay, well, we have these typologies and we have this very wide box of varied tools that we have. I think it's important. The part that we weren't able to really kind of get through as focus groups together was how the process of matching the typologies to the tools takes place when you have limited resources, limited time, and you have to pick priorities. And then when certain parts of certain tools, as was noted here, will require possibly even more deeper engagement, that could take over a year, and then other tools can be implemented, much more quickly. Do you walk away with kind of an uneven process where you're doing certain things very quickly and other things you don't do at all, right? So I think one of the things that I hope council can provide is really clear focused direction around goals and around what you want to see this look like. Because, I think this conversation about we have had decreasing ridership in our TOD areas, and I think a lot of that results in what I call kind of a compromise urbanism that we have here in Austin, where we try to not quite do too much of this one thing, or try to do a little bit of that and a little bit of this, and then what we end up with is a bunch of new office buildings with giant parking garages and we bike racks next to a road where people are still driving at 50 miles an hour, and all this kind of like middle of the road stuff that doesn't quite meet the needs of pedestrians or transit riders, but also isn't quite affordable for renters. So I think this need to be really focused and intentional and say, this is what we want to see. We want to see stuff that looks like this. And I think that is kind of what's missing in this large toolbox of concepts. So I hope that council can at least help steer and focus things in that direction a little bit more. And I just wanted to make two more comments. One is the CAC is really interested to see the land acquisition dollars and the anti-displacement money from Project Connect be applied, focused specifically in the areas where we're going to see these new TODs emerge. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of coordinating between the teams working on land acquisition and the teams thinking about and planning for these TODs, or at least making sure that we own some land in these areas so that we can do exactly the things that Professor Wegman is talking about. And so I just wanted to emphasize that. And the last point I'll make, hope I'm not over time, is around the parking piece. I think there was a lot of really strong, passionate discourse about how we can't have TODs with just tons of parking everywhere, wide parking spaces and parking garages. It has been noted that even when you eliminate parking requirements, there's still heavy incentives on the market to deliver parking. So, looking at the proposal of not only eliminating parking minimums, which I think is an absolute baseline must. We can't have minimum parking mandates anywhere surrounding new public transit infrastructure that we're investing in. But also, this question about capping parking and other incentives to reduce the amount of parking that the market develops. My only concern there is when we had these conversations, afterwards, what emerged in the report was this concept of the 3 tiers for parking, which I think is one way of getting at or translating some of what we discussed in the discussion. But the question about the 3 tiers is, well, how is what applied where, right? And what are the ultimate factors that lead us to pick a certain phased tier for parking reduction? And that's, again, an area where I hope to see really bold, assertive leadership from our elected officials and from council around, well, we really want to see, as little parking as possible in the areas immediately adjacent to new public transit stations. And I hope that we can walk away with a policy plan that really provides some assertive guidance and direction in that direction as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. I appreciate your comments. We've got Bill McCamley next, and then Paulette Gibbons will be our last speaker, and we've got some time for Q&A after that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a PowerPoint presentation. Is that possible to show? Oh, staff didn't get it?
The best practices.
Yeah. So, Madam Chair, let me start while he's bringing that up. My name's Bill. I'm with Transit Forward. We're an Austin-based nonprofit with a mission of educating and engaging our fellow citizens about transit in general, with a real focus on Project Connect. And people ask, why the heck are you here talking about housing? And I'll say for the last 6-7 months, I've had more conversations about housing and housing density than actual transit systems itself, because of the critical nature that housing has in making transit systems work. The more people you have living close to transit, the better a system is going to be. And so we've been really engaging in these discussions, and we thank you very much for the opportunity to come talk with you today. There are, in the presentation, and I'll just go over that, you all have it in front of you, there's actually language in there from the Federal Transit Agency talking about the things that Councilmember Ryan Alter and Councilmember Vela were talking about, documenting how critical the federal government looks at housing policy when determining how much money to give to a community. So we are going to be asking the federal government to fund roughly half of Project Connect. The more we do to get more folks affordably living and working near transit stops, the more money we are likely to get, and really make sure we're maximizing the investment of our fellow Austinites moving forward. I think that's a critical thing that can't really be ignored. I think the number of, as if I remember correctly, is they look at 35 units per acre within a half mile. I believe is right, within a half mile of a transit stop. So that's really what we should probably be getting to, right? And that's really what we need to kind of look forward to. So if you go to the next couple of slides. Ooh, that's all right. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see this is their specific land use criteria that they put in their directions for local governments. And if you go to the next slide, you can actually see they talk about housing and economic development specifically as part of their metrics as well. And so that really talks about doing more VMUs, more businesses near these transit stops. And that's why those things are critical. I will also say, Madam Chair, a couple more things before I move to the best practices. We had a discussion just on Monday about the integration of workforce and trying to make Project Connect work. And I know Councilmember Allison Alter was there. I know Ben was there. Well, he was off. But the first thing that the folks from Cap Metro, Austin Transit Partnership, the unions, and the Workforce Solutions talked about in terms of getting workers was a lack of affordable housing for workers. Came up absolutely first thing, right? So if we want the workers in our town, they're going to be building things like Project Connect. We've got to have housing for them, and that's really important. Second thing is from an affordability aspect. If y'all read the Austin Chronicle today, you saw an article we put in there really documenting how the ability to give up a car is the most concrete thing we can do to increase affordability here in Austin. You can give up $10,000 a year if you do that. That's why this stuff is critical. You go to the next slide, please. I'll just go through these really quickly. We did some research. You're going to see a lot of the same things that were talked about by the panel and the presentations earlier. This is what we found from other communities in terms of best practices moving forward. So if you go to the next slide, this is just a small example of the goals that JP was talking about that they did in 2016 for the Bay Area Rapid Transit in the San Francisco area. There's about 8 more of those lines. I couldn't really fit it onto the PowerPoint and have you read anything, but this is just a small example. And you can see they said, we want X amount of houses by this date and this date. X amount of them should be affordable. This amount of grocery stores or healthcare facilities should be in those general areas. If you look at the amount of affordability, et cetera, and so on, if you guys look at that link on there, you can see their full slate. Setting those goals is very important. Next slide, please. Public land use, and this was mentioned, I believe, by Ms. Tan from Cap Metro. Using public land to set the stage, and that Doc also talked about as well, to make sure that there is an ability to set affordability metrics is really important. You can go to that link and see what they've done in the Bay Area. Twin Cities, they have it in their transit systems guidelines that they will use extra land for housing. In Seattle, state law in Washington actually requires excess land to be used for affordable housing, and they've worked that into their policy where their transit board actually recently transferred 10 sites to the city to develop affordable housing. And in Salt Lake City, they do this as well. Next slide, please. You can also look, and this is something that I've passed on to the Community Advisory Committee for Project Connect as well, doing these revolving loan funds for affordable housing developers where you can give people the financing that they need at lower interest rates as long as you hit a kind of affordability metrics. That is something that a lot of places around the country are looking at. There's some good examples there, and the 3 folks at the bottom, those 3 organizations are really helping lead the way in these types of conversations. Next slide, please. This is critical. And I think the Raleigh one is probably the best one to look at right now, because they did what y'all are considering right now. And they passed their eTOD plan in 2020. But within, I think, 6 or 7 months, they then passed the zoning overlays for bus rapid transit that allowed for more density to be built along these zoning corridors. If you look at St. Paul, they actually adopted new zoning overlays a long time ago, and I think it's basically the minimum you can build is 5 stories along transit corridors. And so these folks have actually been looking and saying, look, we need to do more density along these transit corridors for all these reasons, and here's what they've done. Next slide, please. Talking about parking, the best example I have of that is Denver. That's actually from an interview with folks in Denver talking about, hey, we keep talking about parking, and everyone says we need parking to be able to get financing, all these other things. And he's like, no, we got rid and lessened a lot of parking restrictions, and it actually was better for affordable housing residents because they don't need cars a lot more. And for all the reasons that were described before, the more you can actually lessen the parking requirements and actually add more housing, and that people can use transit in these areas, that's the whole point. I can travel without getting a car, the better it is for a lot of folks for a lot of reasons. The Bay Area did that as part of their metrics that you saw the first time. St. Paul got completely rid of them. They do not have parking minimums at all. And then Salt Lake's transit agency actually includes that in their scoring metrics, which I'll go to next. And if you go to the next slide, how do you work accountability into your processes? And Salt Lake City has this great web tool where their transit agency, now they encompass a lot of different municipalities, right? So they basically go to every station and they say, there are these scoring metrics. We are going to set up these scores for all these different things, including parking, right? But also zoning overlays, affordability, et cetera, and so on. Mixed use, because of the economic development that can happen there, those sorts of things. So just as you all consider this plan, it's great. But a plan without an implementation strategy is just a bunch of wishes, right? And we just encourage you to look at these different places that have done a lot of these things. And I had a talk with Rosie Truelove the other day. I know we've been talking with Cat Metro. They're doing a lot of these things as well. But as y'all look into this, it's something to look at. Thank you very much for your time, Madam Chair.
I appreciate that. Our last speaker is going to be Paulette Gibbons, the Executive Director of ULI. And then Vice Chair Kadri and Councilmember Fuentes, I know, had their hands raised earlier. And I apologize it looks like we're going to run a bit over time, but if folks can stick around, we'd love to have the conversation go a little bit longer before we take up the rest of Mobility Committee meeting items.
Very much. Just to confirm, are you able to hear me okay?
Yes, it's still a little quiet. Maybe we can turn up the volume here in chambers.
I'll speak as loudly as I can and
perfect.
So my voice hold up. So first off, for those of you I'm not familiar with ULI, ULI Austin's part of the Urban Land Institute. We are a global organization. Our mission is to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impacts worldwide. We are not an advocacy organization. We are research and education based. And so therefore my comments today are going to be mostly coming by comparing the document to the documents that Councilmember Ellis put out that I sent in. These are white papers that had come from our Transportation Affordability Strategic Councils that are local ULI Austin strategic councils. I want to start by saying that I'm very excited about the work that is going into look at eTODs for Austin. I heard a speaker once that started Global ULI's Transit-Oriented Development Product Council. And so it's a little sad that we have to do eTODs because a lot of what's being discussed is what we envisioned in TODs originally, and they just didn't necessarily go that way. And so to be purposeful about making sure that the transit-oriented development is reaching the goals is very important. And a lot of what's listed in this document is really what makes the transit-oriented development successful. Looking at the document that I sent out, that's the TOD affordability and access, I want to reference the current two-step process to say that is a very slow process. There's a lot of identified TODs that are currently stuck in the first step and don't move on to the second step unless there's a developer showing interest in developing in that area. And so with this opportunity that we know we're getting such a growth in transit, to be working simultaneously as Project Connect is being built provides such an opportunity to be ahead with the planning and to get the overlays defined at each station prior to development occurring at that station. And that also helps with having development interest in that area, but to make sure the development that's occurring aligns with the goals of what is envisioned for those overlays. It is good to identify what commitments you want across all the TODs. There's going to be a list of items that you want to have regardless of, across the TODs to make sure that they're all successful. And I would say probably, and I'll talk about this in a bit, but the importance of having small local businesses within those TODs as an example. Along with the speed of the process, there's also the coordinated permitting speed within a TOD or eTOD. Currently, the permitting process within Austin, everyone knows, is slow. And so it does hit the larger TODs even more than other projects because of the additional overlays. And therefore to identify and work with the departments to see how that can also be sped up, because the goal here is to get as much housing around transit as possible and quickly too. Also looking at, there's mention within the document about compatibility, but looking at how items such as compatibility coordinate with items such as FAR, because again, reducing compatibility requirements but not having matching requirements on FAR does create where you don't reach the goals that you're hoping to reach. I also want to talk about the locations. We are very excited to see that the bus intersection locations are also listed for possible eTODs. This document I mentioned, the TODs for affordability as a tool for affordability and access, points out the opportunity even before Project Connect was voted on, that there is opportunity for transit-oriented development at the intersection of high-frequency transit, so high-frequency bus service. And so we do believe that there is opportunity to have that density. There was comment earlier about concern about developers really building in that area, and what that takes is a commitment from the city that there will continue to be transit in that area. And that includes items such as having the dedicated bus lanes, having the pull-offs to the side and the curb changes. That helps show that commitment. But also it's a little bit of the chicken and the egg, as since there's already high frequency transit in the area, there is opportunity for TOD, but also as the developments are built, that then provides more riders for the buses. And it's possible in the future that those bus lines could end up being rail lines. And so it is a little bit to make that commitment so that you don't have development already occurring in that area that does not meet the goals of eTOD would have. One concern along these lines is the document has a lot of reference in the tools to the cost being staff time. And, when you say it once, that doesn't sound like a huge expense, but staff time is an expense. And there is a long list of high priority stations to look at. And so the question is, do you have the staff time to go through all that? I think it's important to make the, to put in the dedication to have staff to work on this and possibly increase staff in order to help make this vision occur. We're in a window of opportunity, and getting this work done well in advance of Project Connect really being completed or, well underway even, is very important for the success to be realized. So the importance of including both local business and daily businesses. The daily businesses, of course, are important to making sure people don't get into their cars. I would say the daycare is one of the most important to those. When a parent leaves to drive their child to daycare, they don't drive back home to get on a bus or train. They continue on to their work. They go on with their day. And so looking at opportunities for how to incentivize having these services, this includes opportunities for having tax incentives. I would recommend in certain areas the model that's already in place where the city is a master tenant, such as what's occurring on 2nd Street. That might be a consideration in a way, as a way to make sure that you have these services within the developments that you're trying to make successful. We need to work overall. The development community needs to get past the concept that empty spaces are worth more than those filled with low rent tenants. And so therefore having incentives tied in or having tax breaks help get past that view as well. So part of that, what I was just talking about, it comes from the paper Sustainable Region of Inclusive Communities. The importance in there also looks at pedestrian-centric design and tying into the surrounding neighborhoods. While obviously we want everyone that lives in a TOD to be riding the transit, it'd be great to get the people in the neighborhoods to be riding the transit as well. And so therefore really having great connection, Walkshed, the third paper was on Walkshed, but having the Walkshed connectivity between the time, what do we do about parking? Park and rides are an option to get people from the neighborhood to take the transit. Looking at so if there are park and rides, that really should be a partnership between Cap Metro City and the developer. One thing that also that such parking, and we're talking garages, but having that be a district parking helps incentivize the developer not including as much parking overall. And the reason for that is actually the funding and how funding comes into parking, that a lot of funding resources do require there to be parking even when there aren't parking minimums. But when developers are able to point to, well, there's this nearby parking, that helps. And I'm not saying you build the developer's parking. I don't want that to be a miscommunication, but it does allow for them to have something to help with getting that alternate funding, to get funding without having the parking included. But it does also provide an opportunity for having the neighborhoods be more likely to use the transit. An example of that is Crestview Station, and that areas, a lot of Brentwood and Crestview, considered too far to walk on a hot day to get to Crestview Station. Having more connectivity helps.
Okay, I want to do a quick time check. We've got some folks, I think, that have some questions lined up. Do you want to wrap up the remainder of your thoughts?
Yes,
and we can
very close.
kick
Sorry,
you to the Vice
thank
Chair.
you.
That's all right. We appreciate your input.
And so the last thing is the affordable housing. Affordability is a big problem in many cities, obviously. But one of the big things is that within these, to not have the fee in lieu, there's not going to be a better place to put affordability than at transit-oriented development. And so the importance of making sure that it's actually built rather than having a fee in lieu is going to have the greatest impact. And then also incentivizing options for ownership. A lot of times when we talk affordability, rental is the automatic assumption, and so including ownership as an incentive option would help overall for a lot of our communities. And that was it. So thank you very much.
We appreciate it. Glad you can join. Let's go with Vice Chair Kadri and then Councilmember Fuentes.
Great. Thank you. Just a general question, and anyone can kind of come up and answer this, but the resolution that council passed that initiated eTOD called for a, quote, action-oriented policy document. Can someone help us better understand what specific actions aside from additional planning are in this document? Thank you.
Good
Afternoon. I'm Stevie Greathouse, Division Manager, Housing and Planning Department, working with Warner on the eTOD project. So the document has a list of actions, both actions that we could take in the form of the policy toolkit, but then there is actually a section of the Equitable TOD policy plan that is up for consideration that actually has a specific set of sort of next steps that staff is recommending for actions. And those include really, as sort of presented in Warner Cook's presentation, initiation of amendments to the Imagine Austin plan, initiation of small area planning at particular locations, and then initiation of the work to develop sort of the regulatory pieces of it with the Equitable TOD overlay that's being proposed. In addition to that, there are many other actions described in the policy toolkit that are actions that either other portions of the Housing and Planning Department are already working on with respect to investing in affordable housing, making investments in community-initiated solutions around anti-displacement work, and then work that our fellow departments are doing at transportation with respect to investing in infrastructure that can support sort of the connectivity at the stations, investments that our Economic Development Department is making around small business retention and creation. So many of the policy tools are actually, in some cases, already being implemented. In other cases, would need additional resources, additional community bandwidth in order to implement. So it's just a sample of the actions.
Yeah, and then one more question. Is there any way to benchmark the goals of this document to other city aspirations, such as Vision Zero, Housing Blueprint goals, et cetera?
So we have worked, and within the policy toolkit itself, there are suggestions for metrics that would be used to judge kind of how we're doing towards those goals. And Warner can speak to them in more detail if you need it. But the metrics have been designed to try to take advantage of that additional or that existing measurement that we are doing against some of our other city goals. So the metrics that are in the eTOD policy plan have been designed to work in concert with other city metrics and make sure that we're not kind of reinventing the wheel.
All right, cool. Thank you. I have one last set of questions, if I can. This is for the amazing panel that just went. My biggest concern as it relates to District 9, watching this presentation, is affirmatively furthering fair housing and getting more deep affordability in high opportunity areas like our district, District 9. Can one of y'all explain more about how the menu of options for eTOD will be applied during the station area process? And then I have another question, but I'll ask that one first.
I appreciate that. I'll start, and I think our staff could speak more to how it will be applied. But I think our hope as the CSC, we really are focused on this. We're hoping, while we understand that there are certain station areas that are within our displacement risk typology, we understand that they have risk, and we've sort of calculated and assessed this over the years. And we will use those spaces as areas for investment around these different strategies. At the same time, it's really important to focus on expanding more housing, including affordable housing in high opportunity areas. And to be honest, I think it's important to highlight that piece and move in first. I'm not going to speak for staff, but as I look through the station prioritization, really the stations that are being prioritized first do not fall within that high opportunity category. They really do fall within more the displacement risk category. And while we want to focus on that, we want to be really working to make sure that we are affirmatively furthering fair housing in our city. And this frankly means really expanding housing in parts of our city where we have historically been exclusionary. And that's honestly something that came from our equity tool for Project Connect, where our community catalysts very clearly mention areas that they called areas of historical exclusion. And how do we make sure that we overcome those legacies of racism from our past to really make sure that we're expanding more housing there? And that includes affordable housing, but that also includes just housing in general, more other kinds of opportunities around small businesses, et cetera, as well. I don't know if others have things to add.
Okay, and my last question. Can you also speak on how the balancing act of the timeline for station area planning between high opportunity areas and the areas in high risk of displacement? And I promise that's my last question.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question, Councilmember?
I guess it's not my last question. Can you speak on how you're balancing the timeline for station area planning between high opportunity areas and areas in high risk of displacement?
I mean, if I understand your question correctly, again, I think the idea would be really we are we should be doing planning in both areas at the same time, really ensuring that while we're focusing on some high priority areas that we think are within displacement risk, we're also prioritizing areas for planning that are within high opportunity areas. And I do want to be cautious of the way I use the word planning, because I don't want to imply planning in the sense of small area planning or regulating plans development that has happened in the city traditionally, right? We've had regulating plans that have taken 5 to 6 years. It would be unrealistic to demand that. As we heard from multiple speakers, there's a sense of urgency to adopt these before sort of the market forces completely take over. So when I'm saying planning, I really mean an expedited process that allows us to build on what the work that has happened in the past and taking that forward. And of course, a big part of that is how do we identify areas that it will be certain stations particularly that are in high opportunity areas, do not have risk of displacement, actually have high market demand, but do not have a lot of housing capacity today. How do we utilize those areas to expand more housing without displacing people directly?
Yeah, thank you.
May I actually add to that, Councilor? Is that right? Madam Chair, Councilmember Quadri, I think to put this more bluntly, I think we need to walk and chew gum at the same time on both of those things, because both of those areas are where workers are. At our meeting on Monday, the HR director, Donna Simons for Cap Metro, said that 70% of their mechanics don't live in the Austin area. They live in Buda, they live in North Round Rock. They commute in with cars to work on the buses that we require here, right? So we really need to make sure we're keeping the folks that are in those areas from being displaced, because they tend to be workers, and we need to make sure we're building more new units in dense communities with affordability metrics so that they can use those transit resources. And I know Sharmila wanted to say something.
Yes, I just wanted to take this opportunity to clarify one piece, that when we started thinking about TOD planning to support Project Connect Prop A, that was exactly what we wanted to do. We wanted to walk and chew gum at the same time. On one hand, we have looked at value capture options and kind of having TOD and successful TOD be an instrument for equitable TOD, to sort of have those two efforts come together. So to answer your question, we are working with Austin Transit Partnership, which came out of Project Connect with City of Austin and Cap Metro came together. And this process is entirely joint. So as that process moved forward, as we identified what are the high capacity, high destination transportation node for the future light rail, those are also the priority areas for station area plans. The reason we focused on South Lamar and North Lamar Transit Center and South Congress, those two are Cap Metro owned center. We thought there's a good solid template for the transit agency to put forth in support of the initiative that's moving forward. So we have an opportunity to make a difference here. We want to focus on ridership because that makes light rail successful. And someone mentioned today, I think it's Paulette, that today's BRT is light rail potentially in future on 2040 to 2045. So we shouldn't lose that vision that our high transportation nodes, our transportation corridors, they really have to work together. And as a system, light rail is only a piece of it, right? We are pursuing eTOD, TOD planning, to also be very competitive in federal New Start's rating criteria, because land use and economic development play a very strong role in our competitiveness in that. So all of those pieces come together. So thank you.
Yeah.
Councilmember Fuentes, and then Vice Chair Alter or Chito Vela.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I will limit my questions to 2 questions, given the time that we have. I just want to
Thanks for staying over, by the way.
Thank you to everyone who presented today. My question is for our housing team, and I didn't catch the name of the presenter, but or whomever, if y'all can both come up, thank you, that'd be great. I want to appreciate how you laid out your presentation in addressing what the eTOD framework seeks to do and what it does not seek to do. One area that I want to highlight that is a goal of the eTOD planning process is the preservation of affordable housing, in addition to increasing affordable housing supply along our rail lines. And so that preservation piece is key. And the question I have for you is in reference to the remarks that Mr. McCamley laid out for us, and thank you for your presentation. I found that very helpful, and we'll likely be reaching out to have more detailed conversation with you. He highlighted the importance of an implementation strategy. In the eTOD framework that is before council, it does have some metrics cited, but they're still very broad and somewhat vague. You know, a metric cited is increase the level of intensity of affordable housing, but you know, how much and you know, what percentage by and where exactly, and those are the details that, you know, based on what was shared to us earlier, would help us, you know, set us up for success and gets to what my colleague, Councilmember Qadri, was mentioning about the action part of us doing all that we can with the urgency, knowing that the Project Connect line system, the map is already out there. You know, there's a lot of speculation happening. I was out in my community with the Del Valley Community Coalition, who's received some of the anti-displacement dollars, and we were doing some community mapping, and we can already see the changes set in along our community that'll be along the purple BRT line. So my question is, can you speak to what does the implementation strategy look like for us? When does that come before council? Recognizing that, you know, this council also proposed and adopted a strategic housing blueprint. We are not on track on meeting the housing goals that we laid out by saying we're going to reach X number of housing and X number by each district. So how can, like, what have we learned from the housing blueprint, and what can we do differently with an implementation strategy with concrete goals of actually implementing this framework?
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Council Member. And I'll speak to the eTOD kind of goal setting and target setting, and then I'll let our director or deputy director speak a little bit more broadly to our general housing strategy, right? Because eTODs are only in one part of our community. So in the draft resolution where I laid out all those different things you're being asked to do, those are things that demand council to initiate them, basically, or that we've heard previously in the case of station area planning that council really wants to be the one to take the step to start a planning process, right? And in some cases, it's the charter or code that actually says, you know, that. There are other things in the policy toolkit, specifically too, that I'm thinking about setting a mode split goal and setting high affordable housing goals. Those are two tools in the toolkit that staff doesn't need council's permission to start working on those. So they weren't laid out in the draft resolution, but I think if portions of the implementation strategy that are in our next step section, like some of those, are really important, and I'm hearing from our community roundtable today and from council, then, you know, maybe it's important to highlight that in the draft resolution, or I want people to know that there are other things that staff can be doing that we've put in that next steps, like setting those mode split and housing goals. And
so
then,
can we expect, or, you know, as part of those next steps, once this is adopted, that that staff will develop those more concrete goals?
yes, and I would say that it would be beneficial for me and my team on the eTOD team to understand what of the implementation steps, the ones I either laid out or the other ones that are in that section of the plan, is the top priority, because of course we have staffing constraints and things, right? So if that actually needs to move to the top, that would be useful information for my team to have.
Thank you.
Mandy DeMeo, Deputy Director of the Housing and Planning Department. I did want to speak a little bit to the Strategic Housing Blueprint and the goals that were developed during that process. And the district-wide goals were really developed with the idea of proximity to transportation in mind. Each district has different goal based on both needs as well as access to public transportation. Of course, the Strategic Housing Blueprint was adopted in 2017. This was before Project Connect, but we do have at the time, we had the ASMP, the Strategic Mobility Plan, in place, the bones of that. And so staff started in 2018 with the 2018 Affordable Housing Bonds, already looking at how we can align our affordable housing investments with the Project Connect lines, including the BRT or the Purple Line. One of those, all of our subsidy, our rental housing development assistance, we prioritize housing in proximity within a quarter mile or a half mile of a Project Connect stop. In addition, for the $100 million out of the $250 million in the 2018 affordable housing bonds. Again, I will note that Austin Housing Finance Corporation has effectively committed 100% of that $100 million. We've purchased approximately 60 acres of vacant land, and it is all in relationship to Project Connect, including, Councilmember, as you know, 5900 South Pleasant Valley, which is a vacant parcel of land that was on the news recently because we are starting community engagement to do a solicitation. AHFC purchased that property with the general obligation bonds, and we're going to do a solicitation to find the best developer to develop both rental and ownership housing on that site. So we have been, even in anticipation of Project Connect, we've been using our resources to really align and leverage every dollar we have to get the most affordable housing that is possible in concert with Project Connect.
Thank you. Thank you, Mandy. And just in light of time, I will just daylight what my next question was, and we'll follow up with staff for more information. But it is getting to workforce housing. I want to think through, what can we do that sets up and leverages the bond dollars that we have available, and work with our school district, the universities, the county on developing a very specific and intentional strategy for workforce housing.
Thank you for that question. And it's very timely because, of course, was it last week we passed the item from council, the resolution regarding student housing, which is something we're very tuned into, and are on the verge of purchasing an existing naturally occurring affordable housing in proximity to one of our institutions of higher learning along South Congress. We're very excited about that. With respect to partnerships, to ensure that our public servants, our teachers, our firefighters, kind of what we consider traditional workforce. I will say that all of our bond dollars, so our direct subsidy for rental housing, is committed to folks at or below 50% median family income, and our ownership dollars are committed to 80% or below median family income. However, one thing we have done in recent years is really looked at truly mixed income developments, going from all the way at 30% median family income up to market rate housing in one development. AHFC has a partnership right off South Congress, Retreat at North Bluff, and we partnered with Affordable Central Texas. You may be familiar with. They are a nonprofit. They run a private equity fund that is focused on naturally occurring affordable housing and really serving that workforce community, kind of landing in that 60%, 80%, 100% median family income. We partnered with them through a subsidiary of AHFC, and we now own that 240-unit apartment complex. Again, the units range from 30%, we have 40%, 50%, 60%. I think some 70, 80, 120, and then market. So it's all in one location, and we are looking at doing similar types of projects like this with Affordable Central Texas and other partners in order to ensure that we have a range of housing options, and again, in proximity to Project Connect. So it checks multiple boxes.
Thank you.
Wrapping up questions, Councilmember Vela.
The a couple of thoughts. Removing the parking minimums, or removing the parking, and I forget, that was on the first slide where that was kind of, I just wanted to kind of understand the thinking, I guess, behind that, because that sure seems to be counter to the core of what we're trying to do with the eTOD, and I'm just wondering why that was removed.
So Warner Cook with the Housing and Planning Department again. Our current TOD regulations in the parking sections, they allow up to a 60% reduction for whatever the parking would usually be for development in a TOD. So they don't even actually allow today for 100% parking reduction. Is that getting to your point? In the policy toolkit, we looked at a 3-phase approach, which would be eliminating minimums, and then eventually establishing maximums, and then considering whether the floor area ratio of above ground structured parking should count towards the overall floor area ratio.
Because my concern with a phased-in slow approach is that we're going to end up with a bunch of parking built in the areas, and that is counter to our goals there. I feel like if there's one place that we can be really aggressive, where I feel like there might be, universal support on council would be, going really strong on parking within the TODs.
The only thing I would add to that is that we do recognize that there is a need for some members of our community for some trips to still have cars. That's something that came up a lot in our engagement, was this fear of parking maximum, meaning that folks wouldn't have access to get to where they are. So there's another tool in the toolkit I'd point folks towards, which is the community car program. That was an idea that was kind of generated from our fruitful discussion. So I think before we went really, really aggressive on parking, we need to think about what other strategies would support our community members to get there on that same level of aggression that you're talking about.
Okay, understood. And that said, we have a city that's 95%, very, very parking friendly and overparked. We're not talking about that 95%. We're talking about this tiny fraction within that city. And I just think that if there's a place to go to be aggressive on parking within the city, if it's not in the TODs, I'm not sure then where it would be. And last question, I saw this mention, and I don't know if some of the panelists can speak to it also, on the soft density within as a tool to be applied. And again, I was just wondering what the thought was kind of behind that. My first blush reaction to it was, I'm all for soft density. I don't see how that's appropriate for the eTOD environment. To me, that's a tool that would be more kind of in my house, in my neighborhood, a very suburban kind of style neighborhood. Where is the soft density coming from?
So I think that's a really good example of a tool that we would need to do more to understand where it would most apply. The idea behind that tool is that in council's resolution to us, they asked us to increase not just affordable housing, but also housing capacity in general in these station areas to support ridership. So some of the housing related tools or the zoning tools aren't necessarily for the affordable housing. It's to get to that other part of council's resolution to us, which asks for general that. But you're right. I do not think that soft density by right is definitely appropriate everywhere. That is an idea and a tool in the toolbox, and something that we would need to do a lot more analysis that we haven't had the time to do yet on.
Thank you. And I just, like I said, a good tool seems not as ambitious as we would need. Aves, did you have any thought? I'm sorry. Okay. And I just wanted to throw this out there too. I think our most successful affordable housing program was probably the University Neighborhood Overlay. Just in terms of raw number of units generated. And when you look at the streetscape and what we want to see, and I like JP's question, what do we want to see? What do we want these areas to look like? I want them to look like West Campus. I think West Campus has done an excellent job with the streetscapes, with the trees, with the environment that has been created there. And again, looking at it, how I want to model with the affordability. I think it's a 10%. I can't remember the details of the UNO. And also UNO is I think it's like 2 pages long. The actual code amendment itself. So pro simplicity. And I think we've also got to be aggressive with our targets and focus on those broader, got to get the housing density there, got to get the ridership there, got to make these, centers of commercial and residential activity. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And I want to acknowledge that Paulette has her hand raised. Would you like to make a quick response?
Yes, I just want to say in some cities that soft density is used as a ring around the TOD for transition and provides opportunity for the missing middle housing. I know townhomes were listed as part of what's part of the soft density.
Thank you for that. Aves, go ahead. I want to do a quick time check. It's 3:25, and I've got more mobility committee items before they make me get out of this chair at 4 o'clock. So, yes, go ahead.
Steve, by right from our perspective, is a conversation to be had further away from the station. In close proximity to station, we really should be looking at higher housing capacities than soft density. That is something that I think is more appropriate for within that bike shed when we're talking about 2-mile, 3-mile radiuses. From that further away from the station area, it becomes more appropriate to have those housing capacities at the station areas. Like Bill was saying, the FDA report clearly says more than 35 plus dwelling units per acre, if we do, 2.2 persons is the sort of nation average, I believe that's around 75 persons per acre. So within that first mile, we really should be looking at maximizing those housing capacities to really lead to eTOD success based on the FDA guidance that we have.
Thank you for that. And with the increase in the e-bike rebates that Austin Energy recently announced, I think that's an important aspect of that first mile, last mile of really being seamless with how people access transportation. Councilmember Harper Madison, did you have a question, or did you want to help close us out when the time's right?
No, that's not necessary. I appreciate it. I think Councilmember Alter, Vice Chair Alter can close us out. But I did have a question. Werner, I really, really appreciated your presentation, and I just wanted to make sure that I heard you right. Because something that has occurred to me was, can we just eliminate parking requirements altogether for eTODs? And because we haven't had that conversation yet, it was something that occurred to me. I think I heard you say that that's not an option. That's something about 60%.
So it wouldn't. That's not quite how I would characterize it, Councilmember.
Okay.
The council has the option to initiate any code amendments, land development codes, and eTODs or other, as well as the Planning Commission, to cover things like parking reductions. Staff's recommended tool regarding parking, based on the community engagement we did, is this three-phased approach. Does that help answer your question?
It does. There was a specific percentage that you said, though. I think you said something about 60%.
Oh, yes. Sorry. That was in reference to the current code today. So if somebody comes in and is building in one of our 3 adopted TODs today, they can reduce their parking requirements up to 60%, I believe.
Thank you.
Just 2 quick comments, not questions. I have 2 quick comments because I know we're running short on time, mostly for staff. As you know, we have lots of ideas on lots of housing-related topics, and as we put them forward and think about these things, we wouldn't be doing the right thing if we passed a bunch of stuff that runs right in conflict with what we're trying to do with the eTOD work. And so to the extent that what we're doing can build into what y'all are trying to do, or that would be incompatible, please reach out and talk to us about that so that we don't create conflicts needlessly and maybe set things in motion that would be very difficult to undo around these areas. So that's just item number 1. Item number 2, as it relates to creating targets and metrics, we often talk about units, and units are an easy metric, but I want to also be cognizant of those types of units for families versus a single, efficiency or studio. Those are serving very different people, and so yielding something that's 25 family units versus 50 studios, we might be serving more people through the 25 than the 50. And so making sure that the metrics we set are cognizant of the different people that we serve. So that is just a quick aside, and that's all I got.
I appreciate that, Vice Chair. Do we have any very last second comments or questions before the Housing and Planning Committee adjourns?
I have one last question, minor question. Can either any of our panelists, can you all respond to the parking question from a CAC perspective?
Sure, I'll let Jopala Conley. I'll just say quickly, I think from the CAC perspective, we really wanted to see more aggressive, honestly, policy around parking. And so really, parking maximums are what we're interested in. And we're really looking at from 2 perspectives, what Councilmember Alter was saying. One is that concern of just making sure that we don't create parking today, including structural parking, that we will not be able to get rid of for the next 50 years, frankly. So if we set minimums today and allow parking, we're worried about what that does to quality of space and urban design. but also to the housing capacity and affordability. So we are really looking at something more akin to parking maximums. And I'll be honest, I think in the CSE working group conversations, we were really pushing for that. I know staff is looking at a broader list of stakeholders, but that was definitely, I think, where a lot of CSE members are and were. I don't know, Mr. Conley.
Yeah, I don't want to you just said, but staff is proposing 3 tiers, unless I'm misreading the document. Tier 1, the baseline, is the elimination of parking minimums. And that's great. That's a great place to start, bare minimum. We know, based on experiments in the city and everywhere in the country, that a site with no parking minimums is still a site with way too much parking for any kind of meaningful TOD. So the question is, how do we get to the other 2 tiers, the tier where we're actually talking about the caps on parking? And that is what's meaningful. There's no world in Austin, in Texas, where we're actually going to be doing anything really aggressive or meaningful on parking unless we push hard. Because the desire, the default, the status quo is to build an excess and an abundance of parking. You know, we saw that at Plaza Saltillo. We see that in every major station area. So if we don't take really proactive action on this, we will end up with way too much parking, and we will end up with drivers. And last thing I'm going to say on this, I believe in this very passionately because the city of Austin made me a driver. I was a core transit user my whole life. I grew up riding the bus and the train. I moved here. I lived on a transit line. I rode the bus every day to work. It was great. I was forced to move further out because of price concerns, so I moved further south, and I didn't live on a high-access transit line, and I had to buy a car. The city of Austin encouraged me to learn how to drive and turned me into a habitual driver. Now I'm unweaning I'm learning to just depend on transit again. Right, but the point is that my personal story is a perfect example of how our planning decisions really shape behavior. And so we plan to create a city of future drivers, or we plan to create a city of future transit riders. And at some point, we have to make a pretty bold decision on that front. Thank you.
Thank you.
JP, I think you just made our closing remarks for us.
And with that, I want to thank you for letting us hijack your transit meeting, and if there are no objections to adjourning just the housing and planning portion of this meeting, it is 3:33, and we stand adjourned to let you carry on your business.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I know we wanted to just daylight the long conversations that have been happening for many years around housing and transit and Project Connect. So thanks. We'll do a quick change of staff. We'll let our housing and planning staff go. We've got a couple items on for the rest of the mobility committee. We've got minutes to adopt from the last meeting. Let me pull up my notes.